It was one of those nights when the city seemed to swallow itself whole, rain hammering the pavement, headlights blurring into ribbons of light, people vanishing beneath umbrellas like ghosts. I was driving home from a board meeting I could barely remember. Something about numbers, projections, markets. None of it mattered. What mattered was the silence in the car, the kind of silence that starts to feel like it's whispering at you. Then as I turned down 8th Avenue, I saw him. He stood just beneath a flickering streetlight, hunched and motionless. Rain rolled off his shoulders as if it had nowhere else to go. His coat, if you could still call it that, hung off him in shreds. He wasn't holding a sign, wasn't begging, just standing. I don't know why I stopped. I wish I could say it was instinct, or kindness, or guilt. But maybe it was something else, something quieter, something ancient. I pulled over. The windshield wipers clicked in slow rhythm as I stared at him through the glass. He didn't even look my way. He just stood there, staring down at his feet like he had forgotten he ever had anywhere else to go. I opened the glove box and found the emergency blanket I kept for winter storms. One of those thick military-grade ones I'd never used. I stepped out, the rain soaking into my tailored coat before I could even shut the door behind me. He flinched slightly as I approached, eyes darting up. "I'm not here to bother you," I said, holding the blanket out in front of me like a peace offering. "Just figured you might need this more than I do tonight." He hesitated for a second, like no one had spoken to him in years. Then his hands reached out, trembling as he took it. He wrapped it around himself, slowly, carefully, as if it might vanish. "Thank you," he said, voice barely more than a rasp. Not just from the cold, but from life, I think. I nodded once and turned to leave. I didn't ask for his name. I didn't give him mine. It didn't feel like the moment was about that. It felt like something else, something incomplete. As I sat back in my car, I glanced at the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, but now wrapped in a blanket that looked almost too clean for his frame. A soft glow hovered around him in the rain, like he didn't quite belong to the world anymore. And then I drove off. I didn't know it then, but I had just opened the first door to a part of my life I'd locked shut a long time ago. And that man, he wasn't just a stranger. He was a thread, pulling at a memory I'd spent years trying to forget. I told myself it was coincidence, that I just happened to be passing through 8th Avenue again, 1 week later, with a thermos of soup on the passenger seat and a restless knot in my chest, that I wasn't hoping to see him again, that I wasn't haunted by his silence. But the truth is, I hadn't stopped thinking about that man since the night I gave him the blanket. Something about him had embedded itself under my skin. The way he looked at me, not like I was a millionaire or a stranger, but like he knew something I didn't, like he had seen me before in another life. I parked at the same corner. It was still raining, though not as hard this time. Just a soft drizzle that made everything shine. And there he was, same spot, same coat, still staring down at the sidewalk like it held answers no one else could see. I got out and approached him slowly. "Brought you something warm," I said. He turned his head, not startled, just aware. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I saw the faintest flicker of something. Recognition? Gratitude? I couldn't tell. I handed him the thermos, and he accepted it with both hands, like it was something sacred. He didn't speak at first, just unscrewed the lid and let the steam rise into the night air. Then just as I turned to leave, he muttered a word. "Samantha?" It stopped me cold. I turned back. "What did you say?" He looked up, right at me, and again, there was something in his eyes. Not madness, not confusion, memory. "Samantha," he said again, this time more clearly. His voice cracked, like it hadn't been used in days. That name, it wasn't common, and it wasn't meaningless. It was the name of my mother. My mother, who had died 10 years ago from a sudden stroke. My mother, who raised me alone after my father vanished when I was just 4. My mother, who used to sing old jazz songs while cooking Sunday breakfast, who never spoke ill of my father, no matter how much he'd hurt her. I swallowed hard. "Why did you say that name?" But he didn't answer. He looked away, sipping the soup slowly, like the question had never been asked. I stood there in silence, every part of me on edge. Something ancient stirred in my chest. Grief, maybe, or recognition. He said nothing else, just sat back down on his soaked piece of cardboard, as if the conversation had ended. I got back in the car, hands shaking on the wheel. Samantha. He couldn't have guessed it, couldn't have known it, and yet he said it, like it had always been his word to say. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept seeing my mother's face, her smile, her quiet strength, and then his face, overlapping hers, surrounded by rain. Something was unraveling, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know where the thread led. I couldn't let it go. That single word, Samantha, echoed in my mind like a bell tolling deep in a canyon. It didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. But something inside me, something older than logic, told me it wasn't a coincidence. So I did what I do best when I'm confronted with uncertainty. I investigated. Late that night, I sat in my study, surrounded by a lifetime of controlled chaos, awards, leather-bound books I never read, framed degrees that no longer impressed me. I poured a glass of scotch and opened the drawer I hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were a few old photos of my mother, a lock of her hair wrapped in tissue and the yellowing edges of a worn manila folder, labeled in her handwriting, Ford Family, Private. I pulled out every document, every picture, every clue I could find. Birth certificates, an old marriage license, a few black and white photos of a man I barely remembered. He had deep-set eyes and a crooked smile. His name was written in faded ink on the back of one photo. John Ford, my father, the one who disappeared when I was 4. I remembered so little of him, just a vague impression. A strong voice that used to hum me to sleep, the scent of cigarettes and motor oil, a pair of boots I used to crawl into when he was at work. Then one day he was gone. No note, no call, no goodbye. Mom never told me why. She only said, "He left, Caleb. But you don't have to carry his absence forever." But now here I was, carrying it anyway. I searched old databases, news archives, public records. I found a John Ford listed as a mechanic in New Jersey in the late 80s. Then nothing. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. Until last week. Until a stranger on a street corner wrapped in my blanket whispered Samantha like it was part of him. I printed out a photo from one of the old family albums and compared it to a quick phone snapshot I had taken of him sitting under the streetlight, sipping soup with trembling hands. The resemblance was undeniable. Older, yes. Weathered. Beaten down by life. But the jawline, the shape of the eyes, the hands, they were the same. My hands. I closed the folder and leaned back, heart thudding in my chest. Could it really be him? Could the man I'd walked past for weeks, the man I nearly didn't speak to, be the father who left and never returned? I wasn't ready for the answer, but I knew I was already chasing it. I had to see him again. No more guessing. No more late-night theories or blurry photos compared under dim lamplight. I needed something tangible, something undeniable. The next morning I drove back to 8th Avenue, this time without soup, without a blanket, just a question burning in my chest. He was there again, like the rain had never stopped, and neither had he. Same coat, same corner, as if time forgot to move for him. He sat on his folded cardboard with his head tucked down, and I wondered if he recognized the sound of my car pulling up. I approached slowly. The weight of what I might discover pressed down on me heavier than the sky. "Morning," I said quietly, almost awkwardly. He looked up, his eyes hazy, but not vacant. He nodded once. I didn't sit. I couldn't. My pulse was pounding. My breath stuck somewhere between now and 25 years ago. Then I saw it. His hand reached out to adjust the blanket draped over his shoulders. That's when my eyes caught it, faint but still clear. A long, jagged scar across the back of his left hand. Raised, pinkish, like a river carved in old skin. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that scar. I had seen it once, when I was 4 years old after the fire in our kitchen. It was a grease fire. I remember screaming. I remember the heat. And I remember him, my father, grabbing a burning pan with his bare hand to throw it into the sink. His hand lit up like paper. He shouted but didn't let go until the flames were out. And then he was gone. The next day, the next week, the next year. Gone. I dropped to a crouch beside him, suddenly feeling like that child again, desperate for something I didn't have a name for. I reached toward his hand, slowly, cautiously. "Where did you get this?" I asked. He didn't pull away. Just looked down at it like it belonged to someone else. "Kitchen fire," he muttered. "Long time ago." His voice was low, sanded down by years of silence. I swallowed hard. "You had a son in that fire?" He didn't answer right away, but his lips parted slightly. "A boy screamed my name," he said. Then everything went quiet. My throat closed. It was him. I knew it in that moment, not from a photo or a record or a test, but from the way his voice trembled when he said boy, from the way his eyes glazed over like they were watching ghosts only he could see. He looked at me then, his brow furrowed, not with confusion, but something closer to pain. "You're him, aren't you?" I whispered. He didn't nod, didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. And that silence was louder than any yes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark of my apartment. No music, no news, no movement. Just the steady ticking of a clock that sounded louder than it should have. Each tick, a question. Each talk, a memory I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to believe what I saw. The scar, the word Samantha, the way his voice caught when he talked about a boy. But belief and proof were two different beasts, and I'd built a life on proof. So the next morning, I called in a quiet favor from a private medical contact I trusted. No questions asked. Discreet DNA testing. Results in 2 weeks. All I needed was a sample. I drove back to 8th Avenue, this time with a quiet plan. He was there as usual, as if he'd never moved. He didn't flinch when I approached. "Would you come with me?" I asked. He gave me a strange look, half suspicion, half exhaustion. "It's just a simple test," I added. "A cheek swab. I'll pay. I need to know." He studied me for a long moment before nodding, not because he understood the science of it, but because maybe on some level he was just as tired of not knowing as I was. The clinic didn't ask much. No names needed. They took his sample quietly and we left without speaking. The days that followed felt endless. I went through meetings like a ghost, smiled at shareholders, answered questions, nodded at slides. But my mind was always on that test. I'd built companies from the ground up, disrupted entire industries. But this was the first time I'd felt utterly powerless. I began preparing myself for either answer. If it wasn't him, I could walk away. Confused, yes, but intact. But if it was him, then what? What do you do when the man who abandoned you returns as a stranger, wearing 30 years of regret? 2 weeks later, I got the email. Subject line, results ready. I stared at it for a full minute before I clicked. There it was, clear, clinical, undeniable. Probability of relationship, 99.9%. Parent-child match. I didn't feel the way I thought I would. There was no explosion of emotion, no weeping, no anger. Just stillness, as if a truth I'd always known had finally stepped out of the shadows. The man I'd been giving soup and blankets to, the man the world passed by without a second glance, was my father, John Ford. And I had found him not in a grave, or a story, or a photograph, but in flesh and bone, sitting on a sidewalk, wrapped in the blanket of the sun he never stopped watching from afar. I closed the laptop, and for the first time in years, I said his name out loud. Dad. The word felt strange on my tongue, but not wrong. I waited until the sun had begun to set, when the city dimmed just enough to feel honest, when suits disappeared into their high-rise caves and the street grew quieter. That's when I went to him. I found him exactly where I always did, beneath the chipped brick wall of a forgotten deli on 8th Avenue. His head was bowed low, blanket still around his shoulders, as if it had become part of him. This time I didn't bring soup. I brought the truth. He looked up when I approached, his gaze steady, unblinking. I didn't sit. I didn't pace. I just stood in front of him with the kind of stillness that takes effort to hold. I know who you are, and I said. There was no reaction, not a twitch, not a flinch. He just watched me like the words had been waiting to be spoken all along. I took a test. DNA. It's you. You're my father. Silence. But something shifted in his eyes. Something I hadn't seen before. Not recognition, not surprise. Resignation. I took a deep breath, the words clawing at my throat. Why did you leave? His eyes dropped to his hands, rough and calloused, resting in his lap like two forgotten tools. The wind rustled between us, lifting a torn napkin and dragging it down the sidewalk like some theatrical prop. Finally he spoke, voice low, worn. I wasn't worthy of you. That's all he said. Not an excuse, not a story, just those 6 words, like they had been rehearsed for 30 years. I wasn't worthy of you. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Not with anger. I didn't feel any. Not anymore. I looked at him and saw a man who had once carried a child out of a burning kitchen with a scorched hand, and then disappeared. I saw someone who had watched his life from the outside for 3 decades, probably convincing himself it was better that way. Why didn't you come back? I asked, softer now. He raised his eyes to mine. I wanted to. Every year, every birthday, every time I saw your name in a paper. But I thought, if I walked back into your life, I'd ruin it worse than I already had. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes before I could stop them. How could you think that? I whispered. He let out a hollow laugh, dry and painful. Because I ruined everything else I touched. The silence between us was sharp, but it wasn't empty. It held weight, memory, loss, and maybe, somewhere buried deep beneath the wreckage, hope. I'm not here for an apology, I said. I just needed to know why. That's all I ever wanted. He nodded once, and for the first time, his shoulders slumped, not from shame, but from release, as if the truth had been heavier than the streets he slept on. I don't know how to be your father, he said. I don't know how to be your son, I replied. We just looked at each other, 2 men separated by time and choices, 2 strangers with the same blood. And in that strange, broken symmetry, neither of us walked away. I didn't sleep much after our conversation. It wasn't that I was angry or even confused anymore. It was that I had no map for what came next. What do you do when the man who vanished from your life suddenly reappears? Not as the myth you built in your head, but as a fragile, real human being with a tattered coat and 30 years of silence? I wasn't ready to bring him into my home. That felt too intimate, too immediate. There were memories there, of birthdays he missed, of questions I asked my mother with no answers, of empty chairs at childhood recitals and graduations. The space was mine, untouched by him. But I also couldn't leave him out in the rain, so I made a compromise. Behind my house sat a guest house, more of a luxury cottage, really, a place I used to host visiting investors or distant relatives I barely knew. It had its own kitchen, a fireplace, a walk-in shower, and walls that didn't know the sound of pain. It was far more than anything he'd known in decades. But somehow it felt like the right distance, close but not too close. Safe, for both of us. I drove to 8th Avenue early the next morning. He was folding up his cardboard, preparing to move before the city swept the sidewalks clean. When I pulled up, he looked at me, not startled anymore, not surprised, just waiting. There's a place, I said, stepping out of the car. It's warm, it's safe. You'd be alone but not forgotten. He didn't ask where, didn't question the offer. He simply nodded and climbed in. The ride was quiet. He stared out the window like someone who had forgotten what trees looked like. When we pulled into the gated driveway, I could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. The perfectly trimmed hedges, the stone path, the sheer scale of it all. This isn't for me, he murmured. It's not mine either, I said. It's just shelter. For now. I showed him inside the guest house. He didn't touch anything. Just looked. Slowly, reverently, like he was walking through a museum of someone else's life. When I opened the linen closet and offered him fresh towels, he took them with both hands and held them like something sacred. His fingers trembled. He didn't ask for anything more. That night I watched from the window of my main house as the lights in the guest house flickered on. A small glow in the dark. I don't know why it moved me so deeply. Maybe because for the first time the man who had been a ghost in my story finally had a roof over his head. Not just any roof, mine. He hadn't earned it. He didn't ask for it. But maybe that was the point. Forgiveness doesn't always start with a feeling. Sometimes it starts with a spare key on a table and a door left unlocked. I should have known it wouldn't stay private. You can hide emotions. You can hide old scars and sealed documents. But when you're Caleb Ford, tech entrepreneur, Forbes cover boy, billionaire before 30, you can't hide movement, especially not when someone unfamiliar walks through the front gate. At first it was subtle, a few cars idling outside the property, a long-lensed camera flash in the early morning, a question shouted from behind a bush as I got into my car. "Mr. Ford, is it true about the man in your guest house?" I ignored it, kept my head down. I told myself it would pass. But secrets don't just disappear, they get monetized. Within days, a headline ran in the Daily Echo. Tech tycoon reunites with estranged homeless father, a real-life redemption story. And beneath it, a blurry photo of him, my father, standing on the guest house porch, shielding his eyes from the sun like a man who wasn't used to daylight anymore. My phone exploded. Investors called, curious but cautious. Colleagues sent links laced with sarcasm or sympathy. "Is this real? Dude, what's the angle here? PR stunt or midlife crisis?" I felt something between shame and fury. Not because of him, but because people were turning something fragile into something consumable. He hadn't even asked to stay. He just accepted. And now his weathered face and sunken eyes were plastered across gossip columns, dissected on talk shows. They called him a mystery vagrant and long-lost dad. They speculated on addiction, abandonment, motives. They had no idea. One reporter cornered me outside a board meeting. "Mr. Ford, care to comment on your relationship with the man currently living in your guest house?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm off. I simply said, "This is not a story for you. It's not a headline. It's ours. And some things don't need to be public to be real." They ran with it anyway. The next day's headline was worse. "Ford's private pain. It's ours, not a headline," says tech mogul. Even his silence wasn't safe anymore. That evening, I brought him a bowl of stew. He sat quietly at the small guest house table, the TV muted but flickering in the background. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I saw," he said. "I didn't go outside." "I'm sorry," I muttered, setting the bowl down. "They'll move on. They always do." He gave a small smile, tired, faint. "They never moved on from you. Why would they start now?" And I realized he understood more than I gave him credit for. He'd been watching me from the sidelines for years. He knew what it meant to live in a world that fed off success like vultures. Now he was part of the story, whether he wanted to be or not, but I wouldn't let the world reduce him to a headline. Not again. It started with a box I hadn't opened in years. After the media frenzy, after the endless phone calls and speculation, I needed to breathe. So I did something strange. I went into the attic of my old family home, my mother's house, the one I kept untouched after she passed. I hadn't been there in months. Dust clung to everything like memory itself, soft and heavy. The air was thick with silence. I found the box near the back wall, marked in my mother's handwriting, "Caleb's birth documents." But inside, tucked beneath my first baby blanket and a faded birthday card, was something that didn't belong. A bundle of envelopes. The paper was aged, corners curled, tied with a simple blue string. I untied it with trembling hands. Each envelope was addressed to me. "To Caleb, my son, on your 10th birthday, when you graduate, in case I never return." There were 12 in total. None of them opened. None of them sent. The handwriting was unmistakably his, my father's. I sat on the attic floor, legs crossed like I was a child again, and began to read. "Dear Caleb, I don't know where to begin. I've rewritten this letter 5 times, and each time I get stuck on the same line. I'm sorry. It doesn't feel big enough. It doesn't feel like enough, but it's all I have. You were 4 the last time I saw you. You had a toy train in your hand and peanut butter on your chin. You asked if we could go to the park. I told you, later. I lied. I didn't go to work that day. I left. Not because I didn't love you. God, I loved you so much it ached. But because I didn't love the man I was becoming. I had debts, a temper, secrets your mother couldn't cover for anymore. I thought if I stayed, I'd break everything. I didn't know that leaving would do worse. If this letter ever reaches you, know this. I never stopped being your father. Not once. Not ever. I just stopped knowing how to be one. Love, Dad. I couldn't breathe. I read every letter, cover to cover. Letters he wrote but never mailed. Messages meant for birthdays, for graduations, for the milestones I passed thinking no one was watching. But he was, always from a distance. And maybe my mother knew. Maybe that's why she kept them. Maybe she wanted me to find them when I was ready. Maybe she believed in second chances long before I did. I drove straight back to the guest house that night, the letters still clutched in my hand. He was on the porch, staring at the sky like he was looking for permission to still be alive. I didn't say anything. I simply sat beside him and placed the letters in his lap. He looked down, saw the handwriting and froze. I never thought she kept them, he whispered. She did, I said softly. And now I will too. He didn't cry. Neither did I. But something between us cracked open. Not a wound. A door. It became a ritual. Every night after dinner, I'd walk over to the guest house. No doorbell, no knocking. Just the quiet sound of the door creaking open and the scent of chamomile tea he always had brewing. He was usually seated in the armchair by the window, a faded notebook open in his lap, pen in hand, though the page often remained blank. And each night, piece by piece, he handed me his past. He didn't dramatize it. There were no tears or theatrics, just his voice, gravelly, sometimes hoarse, always steady. The voice of a man who had carried his own shame so long, it had begun to weigh less than the fear of finally setting it down. I started gambling after you were born, he told me once, his eyes locked on the floor. It started with harmless bets, friends, poker nights, then the losses came, and then the lies. And when your mom finally looked at me and said, I don't know who you are anymore, I realized I didn't either. He'd pause often, sometimes mid-sentence, like the memories were stuck between his teeth. I sold your tricycle one night, he confessed another evening. Didn't even get much for it. You asked about it for a week. I told you it was being fixed. Truth is, I was broken, not the bike. I listened, not because I wanted apologies. I'd long since stopped needing those. I listened because I wanted the full picture, not the silhouette I'd carried all my life, but the man behind the myth, the flawed, wounded, complex person who had tried and failed and disappeared, but who was here now, unearthing his own wreckage, one confession at a time. I stood across the street on your 10th birthday, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Watched the candles from behind the fence. You laughed so hard when they wouldn't light. I wanted to run in and fix it, but I didn't think I had the right anymore. He had watched me grow up, just not up close, from corners, from shadows, from behind glass and guilt. One night I asked, did you ever stop trying to come back? He shook his head slowly. Every year I told myself, next year, but shame convinces you that your absence is a kindness. I swallowed hard. I spent most of my life thinking you didn't care, I admitted. I spent most of mine thinking I didn't deserve to, he replied. That silence between us wasn't bitter anymore. It was sacred, a place where old truths could finally breathe. We didn't fix everything in those conversations. That's not how healing works. There's no neat arc, no movie montage, but every story he told became a brick, and every evening we sat together became mortar. We weren't rebuilding what we had. We were building something new, something real. One morning, I found him staring at his reflection in the guest house mirror. He hadn't shaved in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled just enough for me to notice. A half-drunk mug of coffee sat untouched on the counter beside him. I leaned against the doorframe. "You all right?" He didn't answer right away. Then, almost like he was talking to the mirror and not to me, he said, "I've been sober 3 weeks, but it's getting louder." I didn't have to ask what it was. Addiction doesn't leave a body quietly. It hisses. It claws at the edges. It tempts. And in silence, especially the kind we were sitting in night after night, it starts whispering again, especially when you believe you're still that broken man who once sold his son's bike. He looked at me then, eyes glassy but honest. "I want help," he said. "Real help. Not the kind where I lie to you and pretend I'm strong. I'm not." That was the first time he admitted it so plainly, and just like that, we drove to the clinic. It wasn't some luxury retreat. It wasn't private or hidden away behind wrought iron gates. It was a modest rehab center on the edge of the city, surrounded by dried trees and a chain-link fence. But it was clean, respectful, focused. When we arrived, he hesitated outside the door. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. He nodded, but there was a flicker of fear. "Last time I walked into a place like this," he said, "I walked out the same night. Then this time, stay." He turned to me and grinned faintly. "Was that a command, Mr. Ford?" "No," I said. "It's a request from your son." That got him. He stayed. The program was outpatient at first. Group therapy, one-on-one sessions, routine check-ins. He attended them all. I drove him sometimes, but often he walked, saying the cold air helped keep his mind clear. I didn't monitor him. I didn't install cameras or ask for proof. But I watched for signs of slipping, of retreating, of excuses. He never gave them. Instead, he started showing up differently. He kept the guest house tidy, started making his bed every morning, left sticky notes on the fridge, went to meeting, be back by 3. He even started keeping a journal. But still, I didn't fully trust it, and I hated myself for that. Because every time he smiled, a voice in the back of my head whispered, "What if he relapses? What if it's all temporary?" That's the thing about old wounds. Even as they heal, they itch. They pull tight around the scar tissue. They remind you, you were hurt once, don't forget it. I didn't forget, but I was trying to forgive. And maybe he was too. One night, I caught him pacing outside under the porch light. No coat, no shoes, just pacing. I opened the door and stepped out. "You okay?" He looked up, startled, then said something I didn't expect. "I didn't drink tonight." I blinked. "Were you going to?" He nodded slowly. For a second, the thought came. Just one. Just enough to quiet everything. But then I remembered your face when you gave me that first blanket. You didn't recognize me, but you still saw me. He swallowed. And I realized, I want to be someone worth being seen again. That night I stood with him under the cold porch light. No grand declarations, no cheers or milestones. Just 2 men standing in silence, each one trying in his own way to stay. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The glass tower in the heart of the city bore my name, Ford Technologies, etched in silver just above the revolving doors. Inside, assistants bustled, analysts reviewed quarterly projections, and a digital ticker wrapped around the lobby like a crown. But none of it could silence the noise inside my head. It was a Thursday afternoon. Late. The office had mostly cleared out. I sat in my corner suite, high above 8th Avenue, staring out at the glowing skyline. My father's reflection stared back at me in the window. Not his actual presence, but his memory hovering just behind the glass. He'd been sober for over a month. He was going to meetings, keeping his word, being present. And yet, I still couldn't breathe when I thought about him walking through my front door. I still tensed when my phone buzzed, irrationally afraid it would be the clinic calling to say he'd disappeared. I still felt responsible, or maybe worse, afraid to be disappointed again. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my temples, and whispered aloud to no one. Forgiveness doesn't feel good. The words hung there like smoke. No one tells you that part. They talk about how freeing it is, how it's supposed to be this beautiful, cleansing act of grace. But in truth, it's messy, sharp. It leaves residue. Forgiveness isn't a one-time event. It's a decision you have to make every single day. Every time an old memory shows up. Every time you see the face of the man who left you behind. And yet, without it, I felt worse. Because withholding it meant I was stuck. I was still that little boy at the window, waiting for a car that never pulled back into the driveway. I was still waking up angry on Father's Day, still pretending it didn't matter. But it did. God, it did. I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out a photo. It was me at 5 years old on my first bike. My mom stood behind me, smiling. There was a shadow to the left of the frame, just an arm. It wasn't in focus, but I knew it was his. He had been there once, and maybe that's what made it harder. He had touched my life just enough to make his absence hurt forever. The office lights dimmed on a timer, reminding me I'd been there too long. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. Not out of duty, not to check in, but because in that moment, I wanted to hear his voice. The line rang twice before he picked up. "Hey," he said, voice tired but warm. "Hey," a pause. "You okay?" I hesitated, then said it. "No, but I'm trying." There was a long silence, then his response. "Me too, son." For once, that word didn't sting. It didn't feel like a title he hadn't earned. It just felt possible. That night, as I walked out of the office and into the city's blur of headlights and noise, I realized something important. I didn't have to feel good about forgiving him. I just had to keep choosing it. He asked for it. Not in so many words, not directly. But one morning over breakfast, in that modest guest house kitchen, my father looked at me and said, "I want to do something that matters again. Not for the world. For me." He didn't want a handout. He didn't want charity or pity. He wanted a uniform. So I gave him one. I arranged a quiet janitorial job at the Ford Technologies headquarters. Night shift, discreet. I made sure the hiring manager didn't know our connection. As far as everyone was concerned, he was John D., a quiet older man just trying to make an honest living. I didn't even tell HR. And so, under fluorescent lights and after the boardrooms emptied, he worked. Every evening, just as the city lights blinked on, John Ford clocked in with a mop, a cart, and a set of keys. He swept the marble floors I once ran across as a young executive. He polished the glass that bore my name. He emptied the trash bins where discarded ideas and half-eaten lunches waited, and no one noticed. But I did. I began staying later at the office, not out of duty, but out of something else. Curiosity, respect, maybe even longing. From my office window, I'd see him in the distance, his silhouette passing between cubicles, quietly restoring order to the day's chaos. He never once stepped into my corner office unless it was empty. But sometimes when I came in the next morning, I'd find the desk perfectly aligned, a pen refilled, a smudge gone from the window, tiny gestures, silent acknowledgments. One night I caught him in the act. I had stayed later than usual and walked into my office just as he was adjusting a photo frame on my desk. It was the one of my mother. He froze. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said quickly, stepping back. "You didn't." We stood there in silence, the only sound the city humming outside 22 stories below. "She always said you'd do something great," he murmured, not looking at me. "Even when I didn't believe in myself, she believed in you." That photo kept me alive some nights. I sat down slowly, watching him. "You're here now," I said. "Not as my father, as a man who's trying." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw in his eyes something I hadn't noticed before. Pride, not in himself, but in me. Not possessive, not performative, just quiet awe, the kind only a parent could feel, even if they'd been absent for most of the journey. And then he nodded once, respectfully, and left the room. After that night, I let him be. He didn't need validation. He didn't want credit. But every so often, I'd leave a fresh cup of coffee on the janitor's cart. No note, no acknowledgement, just a small sign. "I see you too." And though no one else in that office knew the truth, I knew. The man sweeping the floors had once broken my heart. And now, mop in hand, silence on his lips, he was helping me rebuild it. He handed it to me wrapped in a piece of cloth that looked older than the watch itself. It was after another long day, one of those days where board meetings blurred together, and every email felt like an emergency. I was sitting on the steps of the guest house, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, forehead resting in my palm. I didn't even hear him approach. He sat beside me, silent at first. Then he unwrapped the cloth and held out the object between his calloused palms like it was made of gold. It wasn't. It was an old, battered wristwatch. The leather strap was cracked and dried. The glass face was scuffed. And the hands, they didn't move. "It's broken," I said, my voice more tired than curious. "I know," he replied, "but it still tells a story." I took it gently and turned it over in my hands. On the back of the metal casing, something was engraved, worn but still legible. "To my son, keep time with love." I didn't speak for a long while. My throat tightened. He stared out into the darkness ahead of us, not meeting my eyes. "I bought it the week you were born," he said softly. "Cost me almost everything I had back then. I was young, scared, but I wanted something to mark the time your life began." He exhaled slowly, as if breathing out memories he'd been holding for decades. "I was going to give it to you on your 5th birthday. I even wrote a speech, practiced it in the mirror. But by the time your birthday came, I wasn't there. I'd already ruined everything." I ran my thumb across the inscription again. The words felt heavier than the metal itself. "So why give it to me now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, eyes shadowed by years, lined with regret, but also something deeper, the kind of love that only survives after it's been tested, burned, and rebuilt. "Because now," he said, "I know you don't need it, but I do." I didn't understand at first. He clarified, "You don't need some rusty watch to remind you who you are. You've already built a life, a legacy. But I need to know that, even in my brokenness, I gave you something. Even if it's late, even if it doesn't tick." Silence wrapped around us again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. I held the watch tighter, and for a moment I could almost hear it ticking, phantom seconds whispering between us. I stood up and walked to my car, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out a small velvet box. It had been sitting there for months, a Rolex I'd received as a gift from a board member. I walked back and handed it to him. He blinked, confused. "What's this?" "Something that does tick," I said with a faint smile. "It's not about time. It's about what you do with it." He opened the box, looked at the gleaming face of the modern watch, and laughed under his breath. "Too fancy for a janitor," I shrugged. "Then wear it as a father." We sat for a while longer, side by side. Neither of us wore the watches that night, but we didn't need to, because in that quiet moment, two broken timepieces in hand, we finally began to sink, not to the ticking of seconds, but to the rhythm of forgiveness. It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday. I had canceled all meetings, turned off my phone. For once, I wasn't Caleb Ford, the entrepreneur, or CEO of Ford Technologies. I was just a son trying to make up for lost years. We'd gone to the park. It wasn't a fancy place, just a strip of green wedged between city blocks, with worn benches and a fountain that hadn't worked in years. But he liked it there, said it reminded him of the park we used to go to before he left, said the trees whispered the same way. He was moving slower lately. I noticed it in the way he sat down, the way his breath shortened after a few steps, the way he touched his chest sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking. But I told myself it was age, or maybe fatigue. I didn't want to see it for what it was. That day he asked to feed the birds, so we sat by the cracked pavement with a bag of breadcrumbs, tossing bits to pigeons and watching them squabble like politicians. He was mid-laugh, telling a story about how I used to chase ducks as a toddler, when his voice cut off. And then he slumped forward. "Dad?" No response. "Dad!" I was on my knees in an instant, shaking him, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear myself scream for help. His eyes were open, but empty. His breathing was shallow. One side of his face twitched, as if he was fighting to stay present, but couldn't find the strength. I called 911 with trembling fingers. Time dilated. Seconds felt like hours. People gathered. A woman offered me water I didn't take. A man pulled out his phone to film. I nearly broke it in half. The ambulance came, sirens slicing the quiet afternoon apart. I rode in the back, holding his hand. It was cold. Too cold. At the hospital, everything turned white. Walls, coats, lights. Like I'd stepped into purgatory. They took him behind a curtain. Told me to wait. I stood alone in the hallway, fists clenched, back against the wall, the smell of antiseptic digging into my brain. A doctor came out an hour later. He was calm. Too calm. "Mr. Ford," he said gently, "your father has advanced congestive heart failure. He's been living with it for some time. His heart is severely weakened. I won't lie, time is limited." I didn't respond. Because how do you answer that? How do you reconcile decades of absence, weeks of rebuilding, and the cruel irony that just when you're starting to know someone again, they're already slipping away? I sat at his bedside that night. Machines beeped steadily. He looked smaller beneath the hospital sheets. When his eyes finally fluttered open, I forced a smile. "You scared me," I said. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a rasp. "Scared myself." I took his hand. "You should have told me." He shook his head. "Didn't want to waste what little time we had talking about how little time I had." I couldn't argue with that. "Then we use what's left," I said, my voice cracking. He nodded, eyes wet. "Not as janitor and CEO, not as past and future, just as father and son." His fingers tightened around mine, and in that sterile room filled with machines, wires, and echoes of mortality, I made a silent promise. We wouldn't waste another second. He didn't say anything when I brought it up. Just looked out the hospital window at the pale cloudless sky and nodded once. "Let's go," he whispered. The next morning, I signed the discharge papers against the doctor's gentle protests. He wasn't strong enough for long travel, they said, but we both knew something the doctors didn't. Some things aren't about survival. They're about peace. We rented a car. He insisted we not take anything fancy. So I left the Bentley behind and drove an old dented pickup that smelled faintly of tobacco and dust. It felt right. The drive took 4 hours. We didn't talk much on the way. The silence wasn't heavy, it was reverent. Each passing mile peeled back the years like pages from a worn-out book. We arrived just before sundown. Pine River. That was the name of the town, though on the weathered wooden sign at the entrance, half the letters were missing. The streets were narrower than I remembered. The gas station was still there. The red paint faded to orange. The diner hadn't changed. I could almost hear my mother's laugh echoing between those walls. But we didn't stop. We drove straight to the cemetery. There, among the crooked headstones and overgrown grass, was her name. Samantha Ford, beloved wife, loving mother, nitten sudi titutusen ain. Han kom ik ut radaslet. He just stared through the windshield, eyes locked on the stone like it was a portal. Like if he stared long enough, she might step out from behind it. Then he opened the door. His legs trembled. I moved to help, but he raised a hand. "Let me." He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, each step a war between strength and sorrow. When he reached the grave, he didn't speak at first. He knelt. Not just bent down, he knelt, bone to dirt, hand to headstone. And then, in a voice so quiet it felt like a prayer, he said, "I'm sorry." His shoulders shook. "I was a coward. I broke everything we built. I abandoned the best thing that ever happened to me. And I know I can't fix it now. But I carried you, Sam. Every day. I never stopped." A wind passed through the trees. Leaves rustled like whispered forgiveness. I stood back, letting him have the moment. My throat tightened. Eventually, he looked over at me. His face was red, eyes swollen, hands trembling. But there was something else there, too. Relief. "I never thought I'd see her again," he said, voice cracking. "Not like this. But thank you, son, for bringing me home." I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. So I just stepped beside him, placed a hand on his back and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time since I was a child, he wasn't. He never liked birthdays. At least, that's what he used to say. When I was a kid, Mom did all the planning, balloons tied to kitchen chairs, grocery store cake with cheap frosting, a few friends from school. She always made it magical, even when we didn't have much. And every year, one chair sat empty. His. I'd ask where he was, and she'd always say, maybe next year. But next year never came, until now. After the hospital, after the cemetery, I knew time was no longer something we could waste. We couldn't borrow it. We couldn't earn it. We could only use what little was left. So I planned him a party, nothing grand, no reporters, no gala invitations, just the people who mattered, some of my closest friends, the janitorial staff from our building who had unknowingly worked beside him for months, even Mrs. Rayburn, the nurse from the rehab center who had learned to tolerate his grumpy sense of humor. And me. It was held at the house, in the backyard under strings of yellow lights and a sky filled with stars. I'd hired a local jazz trio. He'd once told me it reminded him of the music he and Mom danced to. When I wheeled out the cake, his lips parted in shock. It was simple. Chocolate. Iced with uneven lettering. Happy birthday, John. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at me. You remembered? I never forgot. Everyone gathered around, clapping and cheering. A lighter flickered. One by one, candles caught flame. Tiny sparks dancing against the night. There were 68 of them. He took a deep breath, eyes glistening, and just before blowing them out, he whispered, "This one's for her." Then a single breath. The flames vanished, replaced by applause. And something else. Tears, not loud, dramatic ones, but silent, steady rivers that slid down the lines of his weathered face. I leaned in, arm around his back. He didn't pull away. I've never had a real birthday before, he murmured. Not one where I didn't feel like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. You don't have to pretend anymore, I said. You're here. You stayed. He nodded slowly. For the first time in my life, I feel celebrated. People returned to eating, laughing, drinking, but he and I stayed there a while longer. Just him, me, and the faint glow of wax still warm on the cake. A party, yes, but also a beginning, a new chapter in a story we thought had ended years ago. One last birthday. And maybe finally, the first real one. The house was still, not the kind of stillness that brings peace, but the kind that hangs heavy, like the air knows something before you do. I woke just past sunrise. The golden light spilled through the curtains, soft and slow, brushing against the floor like a whisper. I don't know why, but I didn't go straight to the kitchen or check my phone. I went to the guest house. Maybe I already knew. The door was unlocked, slightly ajar. The lamp inside was still on. He was sitting in the chair by the window, the one he liked because it faced the morning. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, a blanket drawn up to his waist, and his chest. Still. No rise, no fall. Just still. For a moment I stood frozen, hoping for a breath, a twitch, a sound, anything. But I knew. John Ford was gone. I didn't cry right away. Instead, I walked forward, kneeled beside him, and placed my hand on his. It was still warm. Barely. On the table beside him was a folded envelope, my name on the front. I didn't open it immediately. I couldn't. I sat with him for another hour, talking to the silence, to him, to whatever spirit still lingered. I told him he had changed me, that he'd shown me forgiveness was a muscle. It ached when used, but it grew stronger, that I didn't resent him anymore, that I was proud of him. When the sun rose higher and the world outside began to stir, I finally opened the letter. It wasn't long, but it was everything. Caleb, if you're reading this, it means I made it through the party, but not through the night. Don't be sad. I've lived more in these past few months with you than I did in decades alone, and that's more than most men get. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you gave it anyway, and that gift, that grace, saved what little soul I had left. I came into your life late. Too late, maybe. But I came with nothing in my pockets except truth, and nothing in my hands except hope. You didn't have to take me in, but you did. You accepted me as I was, worn, broken, ashamed, and you called me Father. I will carry that word with me wherever I go next. Don't build a monument for me. Don't name a wing after me. If you want to honor me, love the people around you a little more. Give someone a second chance. Sit beside a stranger. feed the birds, laugh, live, and every once in a while, wind up that broken watch. Let it tick, not to measure time, but to remember what we found. I came late, but I came from the heart, and you accepted me anyway. Love, Dad. I sat there for a long time, the letter pressed to my chest, the ache rising like a tide. He was gone, but somehow it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a passing of something sacred, a soul made whole, a bond finally sealed. Not by time, but by choice. The chapel was quiet, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but one that holds its breath, reverent, full of things too heavy for words. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors on the rows of faces before me. Friends, staff, a few from the rehab center, some from the janitorial crew who had worked beside him without knowing who he really was. They were here for a man most of the world had forgotten, but not me. I stood behind the podium, heart pounding, palms damp. The casket was only a few feet away. Simple. Walnut wood, no gold trim, no flourish, just honest, like he had become in the end. I unfolded the paper in my hands, then paused, and I put it back down. Because what I needed to say couldn't be written. I looked up. My voice shook at first, but I didn't hide it. My father's name was John Ford. Some of you knew him as the janitor. Others met him late in his life, at the shelter or on the street. You probably didn't know what he carried with him. And for a long time, neither did I. I glanced at the casket. When I was 4, he left. And I spent most of my life resenting a ghost, hating a man I barely remembered. I told myself I didn't need answers, and I didn't need him, that I was better off becoming everything he wasn't. I let that settle. Then one rainy night, I gave a blanket to a stranger, and without knowing it, I gave a piece of myself away, a piece I didn't think I'd ever offer to him. My hands gripped the edges of the podium. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness never is. It's not a moment. It's a series of moments. Quiet, slow, uncomfortable. There were days I wanted to pull away, to scream at him for being gone, for not being there when I blew out candles or graduated college or buried Mom. I looked down, then up again. But then he gave me something I never expected. Honesty, regret, vulnerability, and finally presence. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't fight it. Even when he wasn't a father to me, I became a son to him. And in doing so, I discovered something I never thought I'd say out loud. What's stronger than blood is forgiveness. A hush settled across the room. Not stillness, not absence. Something softer, like peace. He came back with nothing, but in those final months, he gave me everything. Laughter, stories, a broken watch, and a reminder that even the most lost can be found, if someone, somewhere, chooses to believe in them again. I stepped back, voice trembling. So today I say goodbye not to the man he was, but to the man he became. And I thank him, not for being perfect, but for showing up, even when it was almost too late. I walked over to the casket and laid the folded letter on top, the one he'd left me, then whispered, so only he could hear, "Rest now. I'll keep time with love." It started with a promise, quiet, unwritten, but pulsing in my chest like a second heartbeat. After the funeral, the world kept turning. The company still needed board meetings. Emails still piled up. Life didn't stop to grieve, but I did. In quiet moments, I kept hearing his voice. Not the voice from the street or even the one from the final days, but the voice from his letter, "Keep time with love." He'd said it in ink. Now I wanted to say it in brick and stone. So I did. 3 months later, the Second Chance Shelter opened its doors. Not a shelter in the traditional sense. It wasn't just beds and meals. It was something different, something deeper. It was a place where stories were welcomed, where regret didn't disqualify love, where estranged fathers could try again, and where their children might finally hear the words they'd waited their whole lives to hear. We built it in the same neighborhood where I'd found him, where I'd handed him a blanket without knowing I was covering the man who'd once tucked me into bed. The shelter had no grand chandelier or marble floors, but it had warmth, paintings made by kids from the community, donated books, and couches that encouraged conversation. It had rooms for counseling, shared dinners, and, most importantly, visiting days. Every Friday, we hosted what we called reunion rooms. Fathers met their sons and daughters again, not always with hugs, sometimes just with eye contact, sometimes with silence. But even that was sacred. The first man to walk through those doors was named Malcolm. He'd been on the streets for a decade, lost custody of his daughter when she was 2. When she came to see him at age 12, she didn't smile. She didn't speak, but she sat, and he wept. That was enough. Every story didn't end with forgiveness, but every story began with the chance of it, and that's what mattered. On the first day the center opened, I stood at the entrance just before sunrise. The plaque had just been installed. Bronze, brushed, simple. The words engraved into its face felt like both an invitation and a benediction. Keep time with love. I ran my hand over the letters, letting the cool metal ground me. A boy passed by with his dad. The father looked like he hadn't slept much. The boy was holding a sketchbook. I smiled, nodding at them. This was what John's life became. Not a scandal, not a statistic, a spark, one that lit a fire that might warm the lives of hundreds. And as I stood beneath that plaque, beneath the soft breaking of a new day, I realized something. He didn't just come back into my life. He gave me a new one. And now it was my turn to help others find theirs.